Admiral Nobite Kondo believed the night was still his ally. Out on the black water off Guadalcanal, his task force sliced through the waves like predators born from shadow, cruisers primed for ambush, destroyers threading silently ahead, torpedo crews rehearsing in their heads the deadly long-land strikes that had humiliated Allied ships for months. The Japanese naval code had a name for this doctrine, Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle. Win the night. Break the enemy's spirit before dawn. But on this night, something was different. The horizon showed no silhouettes, no gun flashes, no glimmer of metal through binoculars. Just a haunting emptiness. Kondo thought the Americans were somewhere ahead, scrambling blindly in the dark like they always did. Vulnerable, unprepared, easy prey. He never imagined the truth. They already had him. Before his lookouts could even confirm a target, they were the target. 30,000 yards away, unseen by the naked eye, another battleship had already drawn an invisible bead on the heart of his force. Radar, a technology Japan dismissed as unreliable and unworthy of naval instinct, had turned the darkness itself into a weapon. USS Washington BB-56 could see through night, rain, and horizon curvature. Her guns were locked. Her crew never glimpsed their enemy, and yet she would kill them. When the first salvo tore through the void, Kondo wasn't just facing a battleship. He was facing the future. The Japanese believed they ruled the night. Washington would prove they didn't even own the next 10 minutes. This is the story of the moment a single American battleship shattered decades of Japanese naval doctrine, and with it, the illusion of invincibility that had carried their empire across the Pacific. To understand how shocking Washington's victory truly was, we first have to step back. Before radar, before Guadalcanal, before the Pacific was a graveyard of burning steel. Because this wasn't just a battle. It was a belief system colliding with reality. For years before Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy taught its officers one lesson above all. Wars are won by skill, courage, and night attack, not by machines. Their naval academies drilled this into every cadet until it became reflex. Spot the enemy first. Blind them. Strike before they can strike back. Darkness was not a hazard to them. It was a home field. While American doctrine emphasized gunnery tables, standardized procedures, mechanical fire control, and, later, radar coordination, Japan cultivated instinct and human precision. Officers were praised for intuition under pressure, not instrumentation. They rehearsed torpedo spreads in pitch-black bays until they could calculate angles by pure mental geometry. And why wouldn't they trust this system? For years, it worked. Look at early war engagements. Java Sea, Sunda Strait, Savo Island. Allied cruisers burned under surprise torpedo strikes. Commanders stunned by the way invisible Japanese ships slipped into range without warning. Those battles became legend inside the Japanese officer corps. They weren't accidents. They were validation. Doctrine became pride. Pride calcified into certainty. And certainty became blindness. Inside Japanese war colleges, radar was described as a foreign shortcut, something for nations without warrior instinct. Even when Japan built its own primitive sets, commanders didn't trust them. They trusted their eyes. A Japanese admiral once said privately, "A warrior fights with what he feels, not what he detects." Beautiful words. Fatal mindset. Meanwhile, across the ocean, something entirely different was happening. The U.S. Navy wasn't chasing heroics, it was chasing time. Who saw who first wasn't about glory. It was survival. America's early failures had forced a quiet but brutal truth on them. The Pacific War would not be won by courage alone, but by awareness, by knowledge purchased seconds earlier than the enemy. Seconds become advantage. Advantage becomes outcome. It wasn't the guns that changed the Pacific. It was the moment one side could aim before the other even knew. But Japan could not imagine losing this edge, because culturally, they didn't believe it could be lost. Night combat was their signature, their pride, their comfort zone. So when Guadalcanal began turning into a meat grinder of attrition, when supply convoys risked everything under moonless skies, Tokyo was confident. American ships were blind sheep. Japanese war diaries called them clumsy in darkness, incapable of predicting swift torpedo encirclements. They weren't afraid of American battleships. They were afraid the Americans might not come close enough to hit, which is why the coming shock was so total. Because USS Washington did not stalk them with instinct. She stalked them with certainty. And that certainty came from something Japan still believed had no soul and no place in war. A glowing radar screen watched by calm operators who needed no moonlight, no flare bursts, no lucky glimpse, just range and bearing. But before that night would burn this myth into the ocean forever, one more thing kept the Japanese blind, something even deeper than doctrine: identity. The Japanese Navy did not merely believe they were good at night combat. They believed they were born for it. If you truly believe your strength is destiny, how can you ever see it slipping away? Would they have trained differently had they realized radar wasn't a tool, but a revolution? Would they have reworked doctrine instead of rehearsing the past? Or was the outcome already written the moment they refused to evolve? Those questions hung like unspoken ghosts even before Kiroshima's armor began to crack apart under Washington's invisible aim. And as the darkness thickened over Guadalcanal, the stage was set. One Navy trusted instinct. The other trusted information. Only one of them understood the future, and only one of them would survive the night. When USS Washington BB-56 rolled out of the Brooklyn Navy Yard in 1941, she did not look like a revolution. Even her own crew didn't yet understand what she would become. On paper, she was just another North Carolina-class fast battleship. 9 16-inch guns, thick belts of armor, towering superstructure, familiar lines of power forged in steel. But Washington carried something far more important than armor. She carried time. Not minutes, not visibility, not spotting range. Time in its purest, most lethal form. Awareness before the enemy had awareness. To the outside world, radar was a gadget, an aid, a tool for poor weather, nothing more. But to the few officers who took it seriously, it was a second sight, an early edge, a way to turn uncertainty into precision before a shot was ever fired. Washington's future victories began before she ever saw Japan, during the months of brutal training where her crew learned something the Japanese never taught. You do not have to see the enemy to own them. Inside her Combat Information Center, a cramped room stacked with cathode scopes and plotting tables, sailors drilled the art of fighting in the unseen. They weren't memorizing instinct. They were mastering detection math at a speed that humans alone could never replicate with binoculars or bearings. Night after night, they practiced blind fire engagements, striking imaginary ships across imaginary seas, trusting nothing except range, bearing, and logic. There was no feel your way through, only confirm, compute, commit. Japan had prepared for a duel. Washington had prepared for a hunt. One radar operator later wrote, "We already knew what they were before they knew we existed. That was the moment I realized we weren't shooting guns, we were shutting doors." And yet, early in the war, even the U.S. Navy didn't truly see what it had. Radar units were bolted onto ships faster than doctrine could adapt. Some captains distrusted it. Some ignored it. Some treated it like a novelty. But Washington's captain, Glenn Davis, did something rare in 1942. He integrated radar into command. He didn't treat it like a gadget. He treated it like another set of eyes, eyes that never blinked. By the time Washington steamed toward Guadalcanal to protect the battered carrier groups, she was not merely a ship. She was a floating experiment in machine-augmented awareness. And awareness is destiny at sea. Across the ocean, the Imperial Japanese Navy still trained gunnery crews to wait for visual contact. The silhouette of a masthead, a muzzle flash, a bow wave. They needed confirmation. Washington needed only detection. That difference is tiny on paper. On the ocean, it is a death sentence. But there was a second transformation taking place aboard Washington, one not made of circuitry, but of culture. Her crew trusted the system. They drilled until instinct became data. They learned to fire before emotion, before doubt, before fear could speak. At sea, seconds are worth lives. The Americans were learning how to buy those seconds. Japan was still spending them. It is easy, decades later, to look back and see radar as inevitable. But in 1942, the idea that a ship could fire accurately without ever seeing its target sounded absurd. Blind shooting was something you did when desperate, not as a strategy. But Washington had already crossed a threshold no Japanese commander even recognized. Her gunners didn't need hope, only coordinates. Contrast that with the Japanese belief system. If battleships were warriors, the Imperial Navy wanted swordsmen, human instinct at the center. Washington wasn't a swordsman. She was a rifle with night vision, fighting men with noble blades. Which one survives the dark? By the time she reached Iron Bottom Sound, Washington had become the quiet counterweight to Japanese confidence. The one ship that could flip the script simply by understanding the fight sooner. Technology didn't replace courage. It expanded it. Those radar operators, invisible heroes in dark rooms, weren't passive technicians. They were scouts, lookouts, predictors of doom. They were the reason Washington would swing first, kill first, and alter history before Japan even registered a threat on their optics. Here's the irony historians rarely highlight. Japan wasn't defeated by American firepower that night. They were defeated by a clock they could not see ticking. The myth of Japanese night supremacy depended on one unspoken rule. They must see you before they fear you. But what happens when the enemy doesn't need to see you at all? What happens when the first time you realize you are spotted is when steel is already ripping into your hull. All the courage in the world cannot save a ship that discovers a battle after it has already begun. That was the hidden reality of USS Washington. Not a battleship firing guns, but a horizon that had already closed around the Japanese long before their commanders knew the trap existed. And in the CIC, when the blips first appeared, Washington's crew did not cheer. They simply acknowledged inevitability. Japan believed it was stalking prey. In truth, it was approaching something far worse, a hunter that did not need light. Radar was not just a weapon. It was foreknowledge. And foreknowledge is the most lethal advantage in war. Not because it kills, but because it decides who dies. The only question left as Washington advanced into the Black Sea was simple. When the future meets the past on the same stretch of ocean, which one survives the collision? That answer would come soon, measured not in hours, not even in minutes, but in seconds. The waters around Guadalcanal did not feel like a battlefield. They felt like a wound, raw, infected, and never left long enough to heal. By late 1942, Iron Bottom Sound had already earned its name. Wrecks of cruisers and destroyers carpeted the seabed, twisted iron tombstones testifying that this was no longer strategy. This was strain, desperation, and exhaustion wearing uniforms. To Japan, Guadalcanal was a bleeding artery they needed to cauterize before America could gather momentum. To the U.S., it was the line they could not afford to lose. The island was not just jungle and mud. It was Henderson Field, a lung of air power choking Japanese supply convoys every daylight hour. So the Japanese fought at night. They had to. Daylight belonged to American aircraft. Night belonged to them, or so they still believed. What the soldiers on shore felt as exhaustion and hunger, the sailors felt as dread. Whoever controlled these seas controlled the fate of the fighting men starving in the jungle. The Japanese called their night runs the Tokyo Express, sleek destroyers ferrying troops and ammunition, slipping between islands like wolves between trees. The Americans called it something else, a threat they could not keep ignoring. That is why, on the night of November 14th to 15th, the Japanese dispatched another force. Heavy cruisers, destroyers, and the battle-hardened battleship Kurashima to smash the last American defenders and finish the job. They weren't sailing toward a fight. They were sailing toward what they believed would be inevitability. Meanwhile, the U.S. had already bled hard. The previous night's chaotic naval clash had cost them dearly. Admiral Callahan dead, Admiral Scott dead, multiple American ships lost or gutted. The Imperial Navy thought the next round would be cleanup, a blow to finish off the battered remnants guarding the island. What they didn't know is that something new had entered the theater, a battleship built not to duel, but to intercept. USS Washington and her screening partner, USS South Dakota, were steaming silently toward the sound. Washington's boilers thundered below deck, but her presence on the surface was ghost-like, unseen, unlit, cold, and poised. This was not a grand fleet action. This was an ambush in reverse. The Japanese thought they were the hunters. They were already prey. The emotional contrast was staggering. Aboard Kirishima, men expected glory, another night kill, another star added to the legend of Japanese torpedo supremacy. They rehearsed the battle mentally as if history could only go one way. Aboard Washington, no one expected glory. They expected work, radar bearings, course adjustments, firing solutions. Men hunched over scopes, over data, over probability. Someone once said Japan trained warriors, America trained operators. But on this sea, operators were more dangerous than warriors. The storm clouds thickened. Moonlight vanished. The sound became ink. Japanese lookouts strained their eyes until they burned. They thought the threat was distance. They thought they only needed to find the Americans first. They never realized the threat was time, and they had already lost it. Radar pinged first contact. A faint echo, then a second, then a formation. Washington saw a fleet the naked eye could not have glimpsed for many more minutes. Minutes that Japan didn't know it couldn't afford. The bridge went quiet, not fearful but steady coiled. Somewhere beyond the horizon, men on Kirishima still believed they were unseen. Somewhere below Washington's decks, a plotter marked a bearing line that sealed their fate. This is the part in the story where doctrine should have saved somebody. But doctrine only matters if the world still matches the rules you train for. At Guadalcanal, the rules were already broken, and only one Navy realized it. Think of the psychological tension. On one side, warriors preparing for a duel. On the other, engineers preparing a verdict. Who survives a night like that? The men who wait for certainty, or the men who create it? Washington began maneuvering without a flash of light. South Dakota, briefly ahead, absorbed the first Japanese attention. Her electrical failures lit her silhouette like a beacon, drawing eyes, guns, and hope. The Japanese believed they had found their victim. They had not found the threat. It was still invisible, still outside their awareness circle, still building a perfect solution for a kill they did not yet know was coming. This is the exact moment, historians later realized, where the Pacific shifted. Not when the first shell fired, but when Washington's CIC calmly announced range and bearing on a ship no human aboard had seen. In those seconds, the future quietly overpowered the past, because the Japanese were still searching, and Washington was already aiming. Two navies, one ocean, separated not by distance, but by centuries of thinking. The waters of Guadalcanal did not just hold two fleets. They held a question. When your enemy can see you and you can't see them, is the battle already over before it begins? The answer was coming soon, cold, thunderous, and final. And Kirishima would be the one to receive it. The men aboard Kirishima never saw the first warning sign. No geraíz flare, no silhouette, no thunder of approaching screws, just stillness. And then, in less than 3 seconds, stillness died. From beyond the darkness, from a bearing no lookout had even marked, a roar split the night as Washington's first full salvo ripped from her 16-inch guns. To the Japanese, it had no origin, just shock. Sound slapped the water like a titan's fist. The blast rolled across iron-bottom sound, as if the sea itself had been struck. Kirishima wasn't dueling. She was already receiving fire. Before her gunnery crews could respond, Washington's radar corrected the next salvo with surgical coldness. Fire control computers fed range updates faster than a human voice could shout an order. This was not aiming, this was tracking. It was as if steel had learned to predict a heartbeat. Inside Kirishima's bridge, confusion flooded faster than comprehension. Officers barked bearings they did not trust, calling ghosts in the dark, blinded by doctrine that assumed the enemy must first be seen. But the enemy did not need to be seen. It only needed to be confirmed. Shells slammed into Kiroshima's hull with crushing force. Plates buckled. Compartments ruptured. Flame blossomed where theory had promised supremacy. What Japanese war colleges taught as the art of ambush evaporated, replaced by the raw terror of being held deeply, perfectly in the crosshairs of something they could not touch. In Washington CIC, voices remained steady. No shouting, no panique, just the silent execution of inevitability. Men tracked a target that was only a dot on a phosphorescent screen, a target whose fate was already sealed the moment Washington saw her, before she was aware there was anything to see. This wasn't combat. This was asymmetry. The next salvo crushed Kiroshima's steering. Her rudder seized. The once proud battleship began to wheel helplessly in a widening circle, like a wounded animal bleeding into the sea. Her crew had trained for torpedo ambushes, for artful interception, not for death by invisible calculation. Japanese lookouts screamed for silhouette. There was none. They fired into blackness. At nothing. They weren't dueling Washington. They were dueling the future. A doctrine raised on intuition could not defend against mathematics. The eye could not outperform the circuit. Honor could not outrun a fire control solution already 3 salvos ahead of them. For 7 relentless minutes, Washington butchered Kiroshima at a range so intimate and so unfair Japan never realized it was dying until systems were already collapsing below deck. Turrets jammed. Fire teams suffocated behind armored bulkheads. Spotters reported flashes, but no ship, just the afterimage of doom. You cannot fight what you cannot locate. And by the time they understood the geometry of their own death, it was too late to alter it. Washington wasn't winning. She was ending. Inside Kiroshima's shattered bridge, the unthinkable became unavoidable. The pride of their surface strike force was spiraling into impotence, while the enemy remained a phantom. Not a duel, not even a contest. A verdict. When her magazines began to cook off, the Japanese officers finally knew what had happened. Radar had turned the night, their ancestral battlefield, into someone else's hunting ground. The weapon wasn't the 16-inch shell. The weapon was foreknowledge. And foreknowledge meant that by the time they felt struck, they had already been dead for minutes. History often treats this differently. It logs coordinates and damage reports and blast angles. But those 7 minutes were not about steel. They were about identity ripping loose from belief. A cultural fracture disguised as naval gunfire. The empire that believed it could not be surprised at night was just blindsided by a ship it never saw. Even retreat was broken logic now, a doctrine that had no vocabulary for being outranged by invisible hands. Kiroshima's crew did not fail. Their training simply belonged to a world that no longer existed. Washington's final salvos were almost merciful, not poetic, not theatrical, just closure. A final erasure of the idea that the old world could endure inside a war that was already shifting into something post-instinct, post-visibility, post-human in speed. Doctrine died before Kiroshima did, and that is why this moment still echoes through history. Not because a battleship sank, but because a belief system did. When the guns fell silent, the Japanese Navy didn't just lose a ship. It lost its mirror. The truth it saw reflected that night was not glory, but obsolescence. Which raises the deeper question, when your doctrine collapses in 7 minutes, how do you continue a war built on certainty? That is the wound Kiroshima left behind. Not steel on the seabed, but pride with nowhere left to stand. And as the fires raged and the ocean swallowed another flagship, Washington did not cheer. She simply turned her guns to search for the next contact. Because the future does not celebrate victory. The future just moves on. When dawn broke over Iron Bottom Sound, the smoke still hung like a shroud over the water. The wreckage of the night wasn't just metal. It was certainty turned to ash. Kiroshima's gutted remains slipped beneath the surface before daylight fully claimed the sky. Her passing as quiet as her arrival had been confident. But the real impact did not sink with her. It traveled back across the ocean, into briefing rooms, naval colleges, whispered conversations among admirals who suddenly felt the ground tilt beneath their own doctrine. The Imperial Japanese Navy had not merely lost a ship. They had lost their timeline. For years, they thought they were ahead, faster to strike, sharper in instinct, superior in courage. Now, in a matter of minutes, they discovered the Americans were not just catching up, they had already passed them without warning. The most devastating weapon is not a gun. It is the moment you discover your assumptions are expired. Japan had built an identity on the belief that it was chosen by preparation, by skill, by spiritual warriorhood. But radar had no spirit. It had no fear. It did not blink. It did not hesitate. It did not require courage to function. It replaced the most romantic idea in Japanese naval culture with something colder and far more lethal. Certainty calculated before commitment. The officers who received the after-action reports realized something terrifying. This wasn't luck. It wasn't a lucky range find or a lucky flash of light. This was the new normal. They were not fighting a better gunnery crew. They were fighting an enemy who could begin the battle before the Japanese even recognized one existed. That realization was more frightening than gunfire. Because guns you could train against, doctrine you can refine, courage you can renew. But how do you teach a lookout to see what no eye can see? How do you counter a shot fired before the mind even registers danger? This moment cracked open something Japan had tried not to confront. The war had shifted from valor to visibility, from instinct to information, from daring to detection. What died with Hiroshima was not just tactical supremacy. It was the illusion of control. Historians often say that Midway broke Japan's carrier arm. But Guadalcanal broke something deeper. Their belief that they still understood the shape of the war. Because by late 1942, America wasn't just replacing ships, it was replacing time itself. Japanese strategists had built doctrine for a battlefield where men saw each other first, traded shots after identifying forms, and closed the distance through courage. Washington didn't play that game. She erased it. And once a battle is decided by awareness instead of eyesight, instinct becomes a slow language trying to argue with a machine. Even Japanese survivors later admitted it plainly. We were not defeated by the ship. We were defeated by what she knew. The Empire had spent decades mastering the sword, only to discover their enemy had quietly invented the rifle with a scope. And now the haunting question echoed inside Tokyo's war rooms. If this is what one battleship could do, what happens when there are 5, or 10, or a whole navy built on radar before courage? The Pacific was not decided by who fought hardest, but by who saw first. After Hiroshima's death, Japanese night operations became hesitant where they had once been fearless. Confidence leaked away in invisible increments. Admirals who once spoke of spirit triumphing over machines now whispered of machines that erased spirit before it ever mattered. Doctrine doesn't collapse loudly. It collapses in silence. In that cold moment when your enemy changes the rules and you realize you're still playing by the old ones. And USS Washington sailed on. Not celebrated, not mythologized yet, just continuing forward like the future always does. In her wake, a truth followed like a shadow across the Pacific. From this point on, Japan was fighting a war that had already moved past them. And the water around Iron Bottom Sound still remembers the night the past finally met the future, and the future did not need to be seen to conquer.